Guess who's back? For those who don't know, my name is Tiffany Rachel, and I'm recording this to officially announce that I'll be starting a podcast series called Baton Touch Tokyo. I wanted to start this series because although I had been pretty active on YouTube about 2 years ago, I never really envisioned myself as a YouTuber, so to say, where it's just creating different contents for different videos that you publish, but more so like a talk show host where you get to sit down and talk to the guests that I invite or with the audience and just discuss about stuff. And in terms of what that stuff is for this series, I do think it'll be like the core would be the things that I've experienced being born and raised in Japan, being African American or living in America and such. Although I don't want to limit the conversation just to that, I do want to be able to talk about a lot of different things. But in terms of like the goal of this podcast, I do want to share with you guys. So the goal for this podcast is to generate a conversation that will include cultural, educational, and diverse topics that will be passed on to the next person and the next generation. So the reason why I named this podcast Baton Touch Tokyo is to first let aside the fact that I'm currently living in Tokyo, but the term baton touch, even though the term comes from English, I do think that people in Japan use the term more than in English, where, the origin of that word comes from when you're in a relay race. Let's say you're in a 4x4 and you're passing on the baton to the next person. So you're expecting them to either continue or complete the race so that we can all win. But in Japanese, it's used beyond just for relays. It's also used for, let's say you're working on this project, or let's say there's a task at work that has to get done. Imagine that you're not the only person completing the task. There's other people responsible in completing something. Then once you played your part, once you've done your responsibility, then you're quote unquote passing the baton to the next person to now contribute into that project to make sure it's complete. So to bring that analogy back into this podcast, is considering making a change for the better good or for the next generation to come. Even though all of us have the capability to achieve that goal, we can't do it on our own. But just like any other company, just like any machine, or just like any entity, if each and every one of us play our role through our talents and serving our purposes, regardless of what you do for a living, then you playing that role could make a small difference, which then can make a big impact. But there is no point if all of us aren't playing our roles, which now leads into responsibility in serving your purposes, if that makes sense. So there can't be a functionable 4x4 race if even one of us are slacking off. We can't win the race. So even though this podcast is not in a race, but taking the aspect of responsibility and playing a role of the idea of baton touch is what I want to emphasize as to what I envisioned for this podcast. So what I feel like is my role is basically similar to what happened 2 years ago, which I was interviewed on several people's YouTube channel, just sharing my experience, which touched millions of people, gaining millions of views, and just turning that into a podcast series so I can continue that conversation and hopefully inspire as many people, if not more people, to generate conversations that maybe people have not heard before. But I also just want to really make an impact where the conversations I have here doesn't end here, nor the conversation that happens here ends up where what I say is right, what I say is wrong, but rather there's this version, there's that version, there's this type of story, there's that type of story where everybody gets to contribute into all of the conversations that we have so that it becomes a melting pot of ideas for all of us to just digest in our head and really consider, so that no ideas or no opinions are tabooed out, if that makes sense, which is something I saw a lot with the YouTube video I had published 2 years ago. And so that's something I really want to make a change through this podcast. But not only just conversation, but me actually doing this podcast, I'm hoping it'll inspire other people to do what they feel like they're called for, whether if it's podcast, whatever it is that they're called for in their life. I'm hoping it'll touch them to be like, let me do it. Like, and I'm hoping maybe somebody else taking that action inspires other people to now do what they love. And so I'm just hoping this becomes a chain reaction, just one energy passed on to another for, again, the greater good. But to reel it back, knowing that that is a broad goal, again, this core topic will be about perhaps Japan and America, and starting with my experience, how we can expand the conversation into other aspects of everything. So I'm hoping you guys are as excited as I am. And I hope you guys will join me in on my next episode where I share more of my personal background and my experiences to get to know me a little bit before we dive into deeper conversations. So don't miss out.